Chair Snyder, we are live.
Well, good morning, everyone. I call to order the Transportation Technology Committee of the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, our meeting on July 6th. Let's begin by people in the room identifying themselves. Mayor Rischel.
Manassas Park, Jeanette Rischel.
Andrew Beese, Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments.
You guys go. You're the room.
You're the room. Just go. You're the room.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie Love, Regional Transportation Planner in BTA.
Srina Budri, Senior Transportation Planner in BTA.
Ian Newman, Regional Transportation Planner, NBTA.
Keith Casper, NBTA.
Bob Schneider, Executive Director of OmniRoad.
Monica Backman, CEO of MBTA.
Thanks very much. We have two members that are participating remotely, Mike Garcia and Greg Perret. Mike, can you tell us what your location is?
Sure. Mike Garcia, Fairfax County DOT, location is at home.
Thanks very much. And Greg?
Reg Ray, Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, based out of in Gaithersburg, Maryland at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much. Thanks for everyone attending this morning on this important work. One quick note, at 9:30 I have a hard stop and Mayor Rischel will take over chairing the meeting at that point. So let's get right into the action items. The notes from our April 13th meeting are available. They're very extensive and very well done from my perspective. Does anyone have any amendments or changes they'd like to make to the notes of our last meeting? Okay, hearing none, I'd entertain a motion that the notes be approved.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Thanks very much. The notes of the April 13th meeting have been approved. Now the real sort of substance of the meeting. I'll turn it over to Mackenzie Love for a discussion of the progress update and some potential additions and new content. Mackenzie?
Great. Thank you, Councilmember Snyder, and thank you to all the members for being here this morning. This is the first meeting of the TTC since the adoption of the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan and since the anniversary of the adoption of the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, or the TTSP as we'll refer to it going forward. There's a brief history of the process to adopt the TTSP on your screen, but in the interest of time, I'll be happy to come back to any questions on that if any questions stand out. The TTSP takes a broad look at technology across the region and in some cases across the country. And part of that involves monitoring development of technologies as they hit the market. And one way we do that is through a transportation technology timeline that is included in the prevailing version of the plan. We update that timeline periodically, and we do so retrospectively so that we can look to the impacts of those developments and wait for them to be fully realized to understand their implications and the scope of their impacts. At this time, we're proposing a couple of updates, a few going back as far as 2017, when we have recently seen reporting that internal combustion engine vehicles hit their peak global sales, for example, and a few other that are more current, including some all the way up to 2022 or this year. For example, the first occupant protection safety standards for autonomous vehicles were issued. A few others will be also added to the TTSP, and we will continue to monitor trends that are similar to those in scope and scale going forward. We've also called out a few other updates to watch below, and that means that we'll just be tracking those to see if additional developments come into play that warrant addition to the technology timeline going forward. With that, I'd like to move forward to a review of how the TTSP's implementation itself is going over the first year. And here you'll see a list of all of the current TTSP strategies on the left-hand side of your screen. and a overview of all of the roles that were envisioned for MBTA to potentially play in regards to each of those strategies across the top of your screen. At the intersections of those columns and rows, you'll see a reporting on the progress we feel we've made so far. I'll highlight a few examples here. First, that we've made moderate to substantial progress in many instances in regard to TTSP Strategy 8, which focuses on advancing decarbonization of the transportation system. And one key example of that substantial progress is the inclusion of related topics in NBTA's 2022 legislative program. Another example of moderate to substantial progress is, of course, in the planning role, as we are currently in the midst of updating Transaction, Northern Virginia's long-range transportation plan, and have integrated many technology-related topics and aspects into that work as well. One other thing I'll highlight here is that none of the tasks or roles are noted to be completed, and that's because of the status of the TTSP as a living document. And that approach was taken to reflect the continually evolving nature of these technologies. And that is exactly, that continually evolving nature is why we are bringing to you today discussion of potential adoption of new topics to the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan. In your April meeting, which is your most recent meeting, the TTC members requested that staff make recommendations on 3 topics for potential addition to the TTSP. I will move through an overview of them quickly now in favor of getting to the discussion of those items, accepting any questions and turning it back to our chair to lead you into potential action here. The 3 topics that the TTC members requested we explore were connected and automated vehicles and related infrastructure, hydrogen propulsion systems, and transit innovations like but not limited to microtransit. And on the next few slides, I will show you the staff recommendations for potential integration of those topics that you will shortly be considering action on. The first recommendation regards the topic of connected and automated vehicles and the related infrastructure. And the staff recommendation is to incorporate that topic into the existing TTSP strategy number 4. That strategy currently aims to reduce any negative impacts of zero occupancy passenger vehicles. We think this would be a great place to expand to take a more comprehensive view of autonomous vehicles and now take that opportunity to look at their benefits as well and how we can maximize those. In order to reflect this expanded scope, we recommend the title of the strategy be updated as well. And the recommended option is enhance operations of the multimodal transportation system through connectivity and automation. We also have provided a few other options for the title of the strategy, of course, up to your discretion. And I can return to bring these title strategy options back on your screen at your discussion for your request. The next topic you asked us to consider was hydrogen propulsion systems, which is a new low and zero emission technology that could be useful in our region. The staff recommendation is to integrate that topic into existing TTSP strategy number 8, which is titled Advanced Decarbonization of the Transportation System. We think this strategy is sufficiently flexible enough to address this additional propulsion option. And we'd like to also take this opportunity to encourage synergistic technologies that could improve resiliency and are related to its existing content. For example, vehicle-to-grid technology is related to electric vehicle technology and can be used to provide redundancy in the power system. Again, we think strategy 8, which focuses on advancing decarbonization, could continue to encompass electrification and these new resiliency-related technologies. and expand to incorporate the hydrogen propulsion options that you asked us to consider. The final topic that you asked us to look into was transit innovations, specifically microtransit, but not exclusively, as there are many innovative options coming out around this mode of transportation on a regular basis. Due to the scope of the innovation that's happening around transit and the potential for further emerging technologies to come to existence, staff recommend creating an entirely new strategy that would focus on transit specifically and allow for new technologies to be integrated as they become relevant. Currently, examples could include both microtransit and bus rapid transit, on which MBTA is doing work now through the transaction planning process. The title we recommend for that strategy is Enhance Mobility in the Region Through Transit. But again, we do have additional options for the title should you like to review those, and it is up to your discretion. Finally, I'll show one more slide about how these changes to the TTSP would integrate into its current structure, and then I'll turn it back to you for your discussion. Here on your screen, you'll see all current TTSP strategies and the two changes being to strategy 4, which would expand its scope and potentially receive a new title, and strategy 8, which we are recommending for scope expansion as well as the additional strategy that we recommend, which would focus on transit. The two strategies that were expanded or are recommended for expansion retain the same roles that they currently have in the TTSP, just with a few additional action items, while the additional proposed strategy uses the same roles available already in the TTSP and applies them to the new topics. With that, I'd be happy to accept any questions that you may have for me or turn it over to TTC Chair Snyder for discussion by the committee.
Sure. Questions? You want to go through these one at a time? Why don't we do that? The first one, connected and automated vehicles and related infrastructure. This was really an expansion of the current zero occupancy passenger vehicle, right? And what purpose, again, remind us, what is the purpose for making that change?
Sure. The purpose for the change is to, the strategy currently focuses on minimizing potential negatives of zero occupancy passenger vehicles specifically. And we're recommending expanding the strategy to also seek to maximize the benefits that other types of connected and autonomous vehicles might have. And while that technology is still off into the future with an undetermined timeline, it is sufficiently developed to begin preparing policy and kind of to setting a vision for the region around those. And we'd like to both minimize the negatives and maximize the benefits. And the expansion of this technology, of this strategy rather, we feel would be a great way to do that.
Thanks. Any questions or comments from anyone? In person or virtual? Okay, well then I entertain a motion to accept that change.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstained? And item passes unanimously. Next one. Advanced decarbonization of the transportation system. That relates to, there was some discussion about hydrogen before, and I think you've gone for a more generic approach, potentially to include hydrogen, but other technologies which are out there that would maybe heard less about or that may come online. Any discussion on that one? Entertain a motion to approve that recommendation.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Finally, enhanced mobility in the region through transit, and this relates to microtransit as well as VRT. And, I personally think this is a very positive improvement. Did I really say positive improvement? I didn't say that. How about this is a real improvement? But this is positive. Anyway, any discussion on this one? I'm going to take a motion to
I have
accept. Yes.
I guess I have a comment on it, looking at the optional titles. This was obviously enhanced mobility in the Region 3 transit is very generic. Is it too generic? I mean, I could be putting in, 1950s buses and doubling the number and enhanced transit theoretically. So how is this a technology or innovation if it doesn't say that? How does the committee feel about being, basically silent on that? Or what was the rationale to pick the most generic of the titles?
I would argue that giving that, so A, if you can find someone to make 1950s buses for you now, okay. But we're dealing with the modern technology of what gets built, what can get approved, what can get planned. It's regulated by FTA. There's NBTA funding, has rules, restrictions, guidance. There's enough layers, but what that does is that's big enough that it allows for a small system like Q to operate, as well as a large Fairfax. With the VRE overlay, WMATA, all the pieces can play, and it allows the independent municipalities and counties to direct what level of service and type they've got. So I think when by itself, I agree with you. Layered into this document, we have strategy in the strategic plan, and then separately from that, we have all the different planning work that goes on in the localities and the regional authorities. That's just my take on it as an operations guy. So.
Quick comment on that. General MBTA transaction may already have a lot of the transit-related components. Since this is focused on the technology, how about adding additional wording and you mentioned the emerging mobility or some kind of new technology, incorporating technology innovation into the wording of the transit instead of just general transit, new and emerging transit technology. That's only the suggestion that I can offer here. This, as written, is general. That's already included in the transaction. The transaction has included transit. But also you have other, reducing congestion, increasing throughput as number one, which we can only do in this region to increase transit. We cannot build our way out of strategy number one. So the combination of that, I propose some kind of either inclusion of technology in transit or emerging transit.
Chair Snyder, may I make a short observation on that? I appreciate the comments. I think probably it's important here to also try and keep the titles of the strategies parallel with one another, consistent with one another. And we, Harry mentioned reduce congestion and increase throughput, which is strategy number one, but we don't in there say anything about technology. I think it's implicit because this is a transportation technology strategic plan. This is all focused on technology. We don't really need to say it in every strategy title. It's a small point, but for me, the biggest point about the recommendation number 3 here, actually the first 2 words, enhanced mobility. I mean, it was the advice of this committee when we started this process that we focus on what we're trying to accomplish using technology rather than, per se, the use of technology is what drives what we do. And I think really that's what option number 3 here captures best. The vision statement of this whole plan is supporting includes a goal about enhancing mobility. So that's the really important thing here. I don't think it matters whether we say innovation, technology in the type of strategies because it's implicit and it would be consistent if we did not put those words into this strategy. But that's just the perspective, was, you know, rationale behind the way we came up with the wording that we did.
So listening to people and trying to figure out some sort of a compromise here. If you look at slide 9, they provided some options. And I'm wondering if, and I'm just throwing this out, something like enhanced mobility in the region through innovation and emerging technologies in transit. How does that work for people? I'm just trying to get everybody's idea. Is that agreeable? Did you get that? I couldn't recall what I just said. No.
Can I repeat it back to you and you validate if it's correct?
Enhanced mobility in the region through innovation and emerging technologies in transit.
I did get it. Thank you.
You did get it. Okay, good. Don't ask me to repeat it a third time. Anyway.
It was great.
Is that agreeable with people? Okay, could I have a motion to accept that?
So moved.
Next.
All those in favor, signify by saying aye. Opposed? That passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Thanks. That's a lot of our decision point. Now we have the critical updates. And thank you, by the way, all of the planners and staff, and especially CEO Backman for putting this together in the first place. Hopefully she's still laughing.
I am.
Okay, moving on now, and thanks again for everybody work on that. That's it, I think, for the action items, right?
That's correct.
Okay, discussion and information transaction update. Keith, this is your product, right? This is the Keith Jasper.
It's one of MBTA's 2 primary responsibilities. It's everybody. My team, most of my team is here. This Batman obviously is the driving force behind everything. Do you want to go to the next slide, Kenzie? So Mackenzie mentioned earlier on the report card that there's been a lot of focus on planning activities, and a lot of our progress since the TTSP was adopted just over a year ago has been intentionally at the planning end of things, because we always envisioned when the TTSP was being put together that it should not exist as a standalone document. It should exist as part of our transaction long-range transportation planning process. So over the course of the last year, we've been doing our best, while keeping it as a standalone document, to integrate it into our planning process as well. And so one of the outcomes of that is the project list. For those who are familiar with our process, the project list that goes with transaction is in many ways considered to be as important, if not more important, than the plan itself, because the project list provides the first eligibility filter for things that MBTA can fund using these regional revenues. So there's always a lot of interest in what goes into the project list as part of transaction, and this update cycle is no exception. We have a record number of projects in the project list right now. We're about to go to public comment over the summer on this, subject to authority action in just over a week's time. The project list has got 429 projects in it. And as you can see in this graphic here, there's two circles. The inner circle is showing the number of projects, and the outer circle is showing the cost of the projects. And color-coded, the key's a little bit small, but the ITS projects are actually shown in a fairly neutral gray color, and the best way I can describe where they are is between the maroon color and the green color. That slither in both circles is the ITS project, so it's the gray part of it. There's actually also in that same slither an even smaller slither of light blue, which is parking projects, but there's only one of those projects. You can barely see it on this graphic anyway. So obviously, the number of projects and the cost of the projects doesn't necessarily track. So we do have a relatively modest number of we call them ITS, it's broader than just ITS projects in the plan, 17 projects in total, and there's about $700 million worth of cost associated with those 17 projects. So a pretty healthy chunk of projects that are in the plan. And I'll set the context here that in MBTA's 5 previous funding programs, there haven't been a lot of technology projects that have been submitted for funding. But I think with that exception, they've all been funded, and also almost with that exception, they all generally perform best on the metric congestion reduction relative to cost, because whatever the scale of congestion and other impact that they have, it's always at a unit cost, which is a lot lower than traditional infrastructure. So I say that to kind of make the point that these projects, when submitted to MBTA for funding, do rather well. They do generally get funded, but I'd also caveat that to date, through those 5 funding programs, I think we've only funded about $17 million worth of technology projects. The jurisdictions generally do not ask us for money for that sort of project, I think in large part because it kind of look to VDOT to do that sort of work, and so it tends to get funded separately or differently to MBTA. But anyway, that's context. In the 6th funding program, which we're in the midst of right now, and for which our committees have made a recommendation on the projects that should be funded. The authority will take its action on that on July 14th, in about 4 days' time. And one of those projects is a technology project as well as an ITS project submitted by Loudoun County along Route 7. If the authority takes action to approve the entire 6-year program and that project's part of it, that will be the first ITS project that has been funded by MBTA outside of Alexandria and Arlington. All the projects we've funded today have been broken. So, for whatever reason, our outer jurisdictions generally have not come to MBTA for this sort of funding. But generally, when jurisdictions have come for funding, it's been accepted.
Let me ask CEO Bachman, is there a way to get that message out to people? Perhaps that's part of the discussion on the 14th, but maybe that ought to be a specific point that's made.
I think you're right, Chairman Snyder, that we do need to make that point. The other thing is, when I talk to some of the outside the Beltway jurisdictions, their challenge is, these projects are more affordable for us to get either through our own revenue sources or through other revenue sources. It's that they come to MBTA for what we call mega projects, or projects that cost a lot more money. Because and I was told this by 2 localities. I can get this funding through other means. It's an easier or lower lift, if you will, compared to $100 million for a different type of project. But I think we don't have to do one at the expense of the other. This is a part of our long-range transportation plan. We have this whole transportation technology committee and the TTSB. We want to encourage them to submit these types of projects to us as well. And hopefully that would also encourage them, number one, that, hey, maybe you don't have the need for the other type of projects at this time, or you can work to integrate that technology into the larger ticket project. That's what I would like to see come out of this. But one of the things that I've heard, I can afford this. We have money for this.
A good example of this, also, it's to hit a couple of the check boxes to make these programs successful. It can't be just an OmniRide that applies. For example, traffic signal prioritization. Right? That's going to require VDOT buy-in. That's a Prince William County project on roadway or a state highway project. But then we have to have the technology in the vehicle. So we have to align the resources first. A little bit different from building a road, which is already in the wheelhouse, to apply that technology layer is just a different level of complexity, but it's something we're specifically eyeballing. We're remapping our services for the eastern part of Prince William County, and we're looking at a couple of high volume corridors for us that our vehicles get bogged down in traffic. So that's one area we're looking at, but that's a highway project. And when you look to it sounds kind of silly, but when you're talking about what might be $150,000 out of a $10 million project, is it worth the side grant? If they can roll that into the big grant picture.
That's really where I'm going. Like, can we integrate that technology into, and sometimes, and we always say, most of the projects we fund have more than one mode, but there is a primary mode, and then there are secondary modes. Can we roll that into it so that we're embracing technology, even if it's a road project or a project that, even parking, can we have technology included in some of the park and ride lots and the transportation demand management project, making sure that technology is integrated into the project without being an add-on or not even being considered?
It seems to me too, the critical role of VDOT, and maybe there's more VDOT, of course, every agency has limitations of funds. So is there a way by which VDOT can sort of incubate or generate the ideas, and then they're sort of moved to the agencies? If it's complex like that, it's moved to some sort of a planning process involving multiple agencies. If it's a different kind of technology and limited or whatever, then the local jurisdictions can be more alerted to, here's something that ought to be pursued.
Right.
VDOT's done the research. NVTA has funding. So how do we move it into the NVTA system? Might be more of a kind of a discussion to have.
Because I know or I should say the Commonwealth have the Innovation Transportation Technology Fund, ITTF. And that's how we're advancing the Regional Multimodal Mobility Program, which started as a smart scale application. And then we were informed that, hey, we really don't know how to rate this under the smart scale system, but there's the ITTF fund. I know some of our localities are applying for and have been awarded ITTF funding, but I do see a difference. To be honest, it seems to be more of the inside the Beltway jurisdictions that I think are applying for it. I don't know, and this gets to meshing the needs of both the inners and the outers and making sure you can bring forth a comprehensive project.
I think one of the key points that would explain why Alexandra and Arlington have been at the forefront of NVTA's funding with technology, using technology projects, has been that unlike many of our jurisdictions, they have control over all or most of their roads, which kind of gets around the point of having to involve VDOT because they control pretty much everything, including the case of those two jurisdictions, the transit agency as well. So, so it's all very self-contained. I think what I would suggest the way forward would be, in actual fact, would be what we're proposing in transaction, and has been a major area, a major focus for us over the last year and a half. Is the potential for a regional bus rapid transit system in Northern Virginia, because in a way it's brought the people together who need to come together. The planners at the jurisdiction level, the transit agencies, VDOT and DRPT, and some jurisdictions from outside of Northern Virginia as well, and TPP's involved too. So I think you're getting all the modes kind of represented around the single table with a huge amount of enthusiasm and interest to pursue this. And the way we look at BRT, technology is a part of a regional BRT system. In fact, Underwrite has been very gung-ho about a BRT including the use of technology in transit signal priority in the Route 28 corridor in particular. So I think a lot of the groundwork has already been laid for that. We don't need to do anything new. Obviously, once transaction is adopted, assuming the BRT system survives and whatever is adopted at the end of this year, the next step is what's submitted for funding. Okay, so there's kind of this step between transaction, which gives you the eligibility to request funding, and the 6-year program, which is where the funding requests are actually submitted and considered. So I think it's that second part, which is where possibly there needs to be some more thought given.
Well, I think, and that's what we were saying about communicating the message, because technology is going to expand beyond BRT. We're already investing in 5 BRT initiatives, projects, and we're proposing to do a regional BRT network study. But there are other transportation technology projects that we can advance, because BRT is going to look, and it does look different depending on, do you have fixed guideway versus the bus is going to run in traffic but get signal preemption. What we are looking at is how to encourage localities, and of course they'll have to work with VDOT, as Keith noted, if VDOT owns most of the roads. In Northern Virginia, localities working with VDOT on, hey, these are some things we're seeing from a technology perspective that can really help with some of the congestion issues, and how do we turn that into an application, and then continue to embrace BRT and the other initiatives.
So on that topic of working with VDOT, the outer jurisdictions when you talk about, that's only Fairfax, Prince William, and Loudoun, very big ones. But as part of the region, we have many small towns and cities. So Fairfax, Leesburg, Manassas, all of those jurisdictions control their own roads and maintain their own traffic signals. There are opportunities. This is where VDOT can do some of this work in Fairfax. And if we upgrade our own controllers for traffic signals to modern technology, we upgrade our own network to modern technology. But I'm not sure smaller jurisdictions are doing the same thing to come on par with VDOT, because they're probably limited by the staff time or the funding needed to make it happen. So when you look at NVTA as a whole and the region as a whole, we do see some holes if we don't have cities that are part of the region do not upgrade their own controllers, their own network, their own operations. And even you talk about the future with more and more technology, sensors, connected vehicles, trying to connect with the infrastructure, we can do our part, but we cannot force the cities to do their part. That is where the collaboration and the region coming together as part of NVTA and maybe educational process, because we cannot ask for money for them.
Yeah.
They have to ask for money to upgrade the contracts we set up for our central signal systems. We made that cooperative procurement. The cities can tap into the contract and just issue a task order. They don't have to negotiate anything. The upgraded latest controller they procure. We did that as a cooperative procurement. The cities can buy off of that same contract to upgrade. But again, that requires a change. That means the staff in those cities have to be comfortable with maintaining and operating all these new technologies. That's where the additional cost comes in. We can probably find the money through NVTA or other places for them to get something new, but sustaining that, the technology continues to evolve, and the life cycle replacement, the more technology you put in, more life cycle replacement the sensor you put in, everything you put in, every 5, 8, 10 years, depending on the life cycle of it, you have to replace it. And the batteries you put in, some last only 5 years, you have to replace them. So everything has an operations and maintenance cost and education and training. That is where I see an opportunity for NVDA to maybe create that environment for the cities to be more coming along, looking at others.
I think that's very helpful because, well, as you noted, we can help with the capital. And we don't know, I don't know what is the ongoing cost to operate and maintain, and maybe that's bringing in some of the localities that are doing it. I believe that VDOT does, or the Commonwealth does provide some money to those localities that maintain their own, but still we would need to, and I dare say do a working group or sub group just talking about, or just having the conversation, what would it take for some of the smaller localities, especially outside the Beltway, because the inside the Beltway localities seem to be more familiar with it. What are the costs? What are the resources that need to go into something like that?
Yeah, just sometimes it's just the fear of the unknown. So when I talk to our own maintenance folks, they have the same thing. If something goes wrong at 5 in the morning or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, at a critical traffic signal, they are under pressure. They have to fix that problem, diagnose the problem, and fix it in a matter of minutes. They cannot take hours and days to fix the problem. So, which is slightly different from normal roadway maintenance. So that is where the resistance to change and some of those things come in. Only the way to do that, we just continue to educate our workforce and introduce these things slowly for them to get comfortable and get trained on, so we feel comfortable if something happens at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they can really swap something out and put the processes in place for them to fix it. And the additional cost of this maintenance is, Mark, you were on that call last week regarding RM3P, when we go around, it's okay, this needs to be sustained. There's not a single hand raised by anybody in the team, to say that we will fund a little bit of this for sustainment. And that's what you're doing. So if you don't have a sustainment conversation, and it's hard for people to adapt or take a chance of taking on something.
If I might just jump in. So, as Monica said, EPA 70% can be used for capacity increase, but 30% funds can be used for operations, and some of our smaller jurisdictions use that funds for, I have seen, for transit and some of the technology improvement projects too, but it may be a one-time, they may have to do it every year for a certain period of time they have to do it. In addition, you mentioned about VDOT maintaining improvements of signal controllers in Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William counties. In some of the regional CMAQ money goes into that project. The region and VDOT shares that responsibility for those 3 counties. We, during this project update for project list update for transaction, we talked to the jurisdictions, and many of them were, as you said correctly, the smaller cities and all, they were not thinking in that direction. This is one way we probably can improve our signals and all, and partly what I heard is the staff issues. There is not enough staff. There is one person maybe who is dealing with all the signals in say City of Fairfax. The person is comfortable with what he is doing now, doesn't want to change things and get into that sort of trouble that you mentioned. He cannot solve the problem within minutes. So they are not probably thinking in that direction.
It isn't always a case of not wanting to change. All the smaller localities each face our own special challenges, financial, short staffing. Our staff would love to move on and do more things And as we increase the amount of staff, they will have the time to take the extra training. So it's a variety of problems.
It is, and that's why I said, when I talked to them, that's when they said, we really didn't think it in that direction, but thank you for bringing it up. We want to do that. So it's not that they don't want to do that.
Right.
And I think with technology, there's always concern because on the authority's end, everything we fund with the 70% must reach its useful life, whatever that time period or time span is. If it does not, then we're in a position of having to get the residual, of what was used versus the money we spent on it. Like, where's the delta between the useful life and what the locality or agency received from it? We haven't had to do that, but I know with technology and the way technology evolves, everyone wants to make sure whatever it is we're investing in, the useful life does materialize. The other thing is when we start talking about funding, and I don't want to get into politics, we have 2 elected officials here, but there is the discussion on who's responsible for what. Who is responsible for funding what? I think, and I'll just say it, at MBTA level, people say, oh, you have all of this money. You have all of this money. We're like the goose that laid the golden egg. But if you go to our audit, there is a table at the end of the audit shows every project we funded, and there's a corresponding line item to funding. It's a zero-sum game. We don't have any money unallocated. And I think it gets to who's responsible for what. And I hate to treat funding like a jurisdictional line because it really should be us working together to make sure these projects materialize. But that's something else you'll hear. And to get to your point about the last week, no one raising their hand, if you're talking about, okay, who's responsible for what? Because once you put your hand out there and say, go fund it, there is the expectation that you will continue to invest in it.
So here's my thought, so that this discussion isn't lost, that maybe the MBTA, if it's okay with you, sort of come back with some ideas about, really what we're talking about is moving the ideas and plan to reality. Operationalizing. And I don't know whether it's flow charts or what, but it clearly involves VDOT, it clearly involves, I think we're all in agreement there are significant upsides to this. Huge upsides potentially at a fairly reasonable cost. But we're not realizing it. So how do we move from the learning and the information that's planned into eventual projects? That's
one thing I would consider that NVTA could bring to the market that no one else in the public side does is NVTA could be willing to allow a little risk of technology. And what I mean by that is when you apply those FTA dollars, it has to work. And you're locked into that technology for a long time. And if it doesn't work, you get the stick. So what ends up happening is we end up being very slow. The transit systems, the engineers, the road build, everything just moves at a snail's pace because we're not permitted to be wrong. And if we're wrong, even if it's just 15% wrong, there's a punishment that comes with that. If you want to drive innovation, finding a way to permit an acceptable amount of risk in a new technology that may or may not come to fruition. Understanding that and building. The private sector does it all the time. But the private sector doesn't show up for us. We end up adopting what the private sector wants, so we're always a generation behind. Always. Because it has to be in the 90s, it came out of the military. So the military technology then moved into fleet management, which then moved into transit management. So we were 20 years behind on that. And so that's one of the things where I think, I don't know how you do it. It's just,
illegal.
It's just it's a concept. But where you could be different is you could either mitigate risk, or B, find a way to fix projects that didn't work. So I'm just gonna make something up. Let's say OmniRide had bought battery electric buses and we failed to get the right kind of charging technology for a route in Manassas Park. The ability for NVTA to come in and fund the capital infrastructure to fix that allows that technology to advance. And then, so it's like, wow, if we knew then what we know now, that might be an avenue. But that's just from an operational perspective.
And I appreciate what you just said. Unfortunately, the MBTA has been under scrutiny. And the MBTA has to be very careful what it does and how it spends its funding.
Yeah, I mean, this is big picture cloud ideas.
But this is why I like when the authority is not the sole funding entity on a project, because maybe there are other funding sources that are on the project that does have that flexibility, so you can still move the project forward with MBTA revenues, even if that means going back to say, hey, this didn't work out, but we can still advance because we have 70%. I totally get what you're saying, Bob, and I think as the authority has evolved, it makes sense. But there is what Ms. Rischel has identified, the legal requirements that we're under says you have to meet your useful life.
Yeah, one thing.
Very valid point that you made.
The only thing that I would suggest is maybe adding some kind of a pot of money within the BTA focused on the technology adoption. So,
I love
for example, we have done the risk using ITPF funding because we struggled with that at the Commonwealth level. Finally, legislature gave us that tool, ITPF funding, that when we present to the board and we say, these are the projects we recommend, but there is a risk of failure because there's a small amount of money we're putting on this to try it out. And so we publicly discuss it. And when the board adopts that project, we do our best to make that project success. But the board and the public is aware of time needed, that limited amount of money. It's not the entire program. Out of $24 billion 6-year program that we have, ITPF is $20 million, right? So that allows us to take risks on some of them. But some of those we take the risks and prove certain things that we adapt, the cities could adapt quickly based on the proven technology that you can fund, as opposed to even trying new things out. The parking, we're trying new things out. If that's adaptable, crowdsourced parking, for example. You don't have to build the technology. You can adapt what we are coming up with at the state level. That's the area where you may want to look at and minimize your risk at the same time, advance some of these.
We are all open to, if the General Assembly wants to provide additional funding that are not governed under the requirements of HB 2313.
No, but the adoption of that.
No, but I'm saying what you said is really what Bob said, and it's a legal entity, not entity, a legal requirement. We can't set aside any money to do something else other than what's identified in HB 2313 and HB 599. That's why I said I love what you said, but the way HB 2313 is written, we cannot do it. Now, if there's another funding source that comes along and says, well, this money isn't governed by HB 2313, you have more flexibility. And I know when we have our authority meetings, every time the General Assembly is in session, when there is a bill that relates to us, it has to be a bill that really changes the structure of HB 2313 to make any allowances were set aside.
Loosely phrased, right out of the original.
Well, I mean, really, I would love it, but as the laws are written today, every dime we have is, even when we got new money under the omnibus bill, it says, oh, and this, you have to use it according to HB 2313, and that includes what was formerly the I-81 money. And I'm like, wow, how do we do that? It's all has to be governed how HB 2313 is written.
So here's my suggestion moving forward again. I think maybe the subject of our next meeting ought to be exactly this. Okay?
Yeah.
And in the meantime, a couple things. Staff has been very creative. We've had a discussion. We need to make sure that DDOT is very much involved in any sort of options we put forward. We should also have the council review 2313 and see what options may be available to pursue technology projects that may carry reasonable risk, not outrageous risk, but reasonable risk. And if it's agreeable, then that'll be a major subject of our next meeting. How we move, yeah, sure.
So moved, whatever he said.
In favor, second.
We got ask MBTA staff to work with other interested parties to determine the best ways to options for operationalizing the technology priorities. So,
No, definitely.
any discussion? Those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thanks for an excellent discussion. I
Thank you.
apologize. I want to stop for a family-related thing, but I want to thank everybody for great work. And Mayor Michel will do a great job of finishing having done so much damage. You have to repair what I've just done. Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Where are we now? We are at
Seven.
number 7?
Yes,
Are we at number 7?
we are.
Okay.
Unless Keith, you had anything else on transaction?
There was just one other thing I wanted to mention, the scenario analysis that we've done for transaction. I won't get into the weeds on this because we'll be here for 2 hours and we still probably won't finish, but when we do scenario analysis, it's our attempt to factor in uncertainty in the long-range transportation planning process when we're looking out to 2045. You know, it's anybody's guess what 2045 is going to look like. We have our best guess. You know, we build upon a lot of the great work that COG and TPB do, but in our scenario analysis, we kind of change some assumptions and say, well, what if this happened instead of that? What if you know, the new normal after the pandemic includes some travel behavior changes that happened because of the pandemic, even though the pandemic may have gone away? You know, we look at potential transportation policies which kind of thrown around, and which this region has actually done, you know, some pretty good groundwork in terms of looking at changing travel behaviors by the use of incentives and pricing. And then as part of the integration of the TTSP into transaction, we specifically wanted a scenario that looked at technology as well. So combinations of connected, automated, shared, and electric vehicles was part of our technology scenario. So we ran some analysis on these, which is on the screen here. And essentially what these numbers are showing you is even if none of the projects that are in transaction, the 439 projects that are in transaction, assuming none of those are built by 2045, if these scenarios came to be, and these scenarios are basically, you know, our thoughts about, you know, what if situations, is not projections, predictions, preferences, they're just considered to be plausible, things that could happen, and if they did, this is what 2045 would look like without any new projects funded by MBTA compared to what's already funded and built. So the 3 scenarios are shown here: new normal, technology, and incentives / pricing. I'll say for the first 2, new normal and technology, these things will happen to us. We don't have a great deal of influence over what these 2 scenarios will look like. Incentives and pricing is different. Incentives and pricing can only happen if there are kind of multi-layered government policies that enable it to happen. And then with all 3 of these scenarios, what we do is we give our best guess of what we think travelers will do in response to each of these three scenarios. And we don't get into the details of the mechanics of how things would actually work. We just model what-if situations. So with each of the three scenarios, you do see, and looking at 2045, motorized person trips. So this is people who travel in autos or on transit in some form. The new normal will result in a reduction in trip making compared to if our standard forecast or standard view of the future transpires. So basically, if there's a new normal type situation in 2045, we'll get 4.5% less trip making than we would otherwise get. With technology, it's 3% less, and with incentives and pricing, it's 4.5% less. With transit trips, while this may be a concern, probably not surprised either. In a new normal situation, 11% fewer transit trips compared to our standard view of 2045. Technology also reduces transit trips by a slightly higher amount. Incentives and pricing is the only one of the three scenarios which actually increases transit trips. And it does that because essentially people are incentivized to ride transit and priced away from driving alone. And so there are other measures here that you can see each of the scenarios has some impacts on some things that are of great interest to us, like person hours of delay. All of these scenarios actually result in an impact on person hours of delay, which is actually, considering no money is being spent for these things to happen, is pretty impressive. Technology leading to a 25% reduction in person hours of delay with no investment in new projects. Even the new normal reduces person hours of delay by 14%. Duration of severe congestion, job accessibility is improved under each of these three scenarios. And emissions, which is where I kind of want to just kind of leave this, is pretty impressive for technology with a reduction of 28% in emissions. Still some reductions for new normal and the incentives pricing scenarios, but what's really driving down the emissions in the technology scenario are the assumptions about the market penetration of electric vehicles. That's what really pushes. We consider electric vehicles to be part of the technology scenario, and so that gives you an idea of what can be done. And the assumptions here that are driving this were 20% reduction, 20% market penetration of electric vehicles for general consumer use, 100% of all Uber or Lyft vehicles would be fully automated. I'm not sure what the electrification part of that is.
Well, one thing to note, I don't know if you saw this in the newspaper, but the EU banned the internal combustion engine after 2035. So that'll immediately start to hit BMW, Audi, Volvo, Volkswagen, etc. And I don't know how they're going to approach freight. But you're going to see major manufacturers who are looked at as the U.S. is often luxury are going to start migrating that way. But if we're always behind Europe, but we still follow them eventually because that stuff tends to work. So, but it's just having that, it's not just a U.S. question. It is not just a policy question of should we. It is a European decision of we will. So 13 years isn't that far.
No, it's not. Yeah. So there's a lot of assumptions that have gone into the technology scenario that addressing market penetration of the different types of vehicles, many of which you can't buy today, reductions in operating costs, changes in trip-making behavior. We have to make some assumptions about zero occupancy vehicle trips. even though we have a strategy which is very focused, at least until today, on trying to avoid situations where we have a lot of mileage conducted by zero optimum vehicles. Some assumptions that automation will bring capacity increases, and we make assumptions that will be higher on freeways than major arterials, and we make no assumptions about any capacity increase on anything lower than major arterials in the functional classification system, automated shuttles, and no land use changes. So just want to give you a flavor. This is looking at an analysis where none of the 429 projects are included. We've repeated this analysis with the 429 projects included to see what the impact of these scenarios would be if all the projects in transaction were funded and built, which isn't going to happen because there's $75 billion worth of projects in transaction, and MBTA and probably the region doesn't have $75 billion between now and 2045. So it won't all happen, but the analysis we've done, we've got a draft of the plan which we'll be sharing with folks fairly soon to get some insights into what that means. And having whetted your appetite, I'm going to stop.
So then a quick comment, thanks for the comment on Cloud PPD, some of the basis of the modeling. As you may know, last month, the Transportation Planning Board approved our latest plan, Visualize 2045, and in that approval action, the board asked for some specific things. They first of all asked for a new plan 2 years from now, not 4. And another thing they asked for is to have the new plan based on scenario analysis. So well, maybe we'll have synergistic or dueling scenario analysis. I don't know. And it's interesting because, you know, obviously what you've done is you just sort of left the projects alone and then varied some background assumptions. You know, you didn't vary the project list, which some people would like to do. I don't know. But anyway, I think I really admire this work, and I think we'll see some more interesting scenario analysis in the next couple of years.
Any other comments?
Yeah, good comment. Looking at this, if I understand correctly, even if you don't build anything, you're still going to see 4.5% reduction in trips and 11% reduction in transit. I mean, if you look at the delay, person hours of delay reduced by 15% between now and 2045. That's a huge reduction.
And when we qualify that, that's a 4.5% reduction in vehicle trips in 25 when you compare the scenario with no scenario. It's not between now and 2045, it's in 2045.
But is there a comparison that you can show between 2025 and 2045?
Yeah.
Just by looking at it, somebody could misconstrue that reduction. So why are we doing anything kind of questions?
Yeah.
Just by looking at the numbers on a piece of paper, I'm just worried people could take it the wrong way. But you compare that to today's congestion, it could still be double, right? So it could be 50% more, 25%, whatever. Between now and 2025, it could be 50% more, but on the new normal, it's
less than it would have been.
less than 50%. So that's the kind of
Yeah.
message may get lost. Is
Yeah.
what I just want to talk about.
Yeah, the draft plan attempts to do that, and you know, part of our, you know, our pre-release review is to make sure that we not confuse people by the way we've attempted to explain it. But it's a very good point, and to that point, you know, between now and 2045, you have to keep in mind a 23% increase in population in Northern Virginia, a 33% increase in jobs in Northern Virginia. That will generate trips on an already saturated network. But the way it generates trips is, you know, it's going to be different to what it might have been, at least how we might have thought about it 3 years ago, pre-pandemic. now, scenario analysis is really important because the pre-pandemic rules may not work anymore. But it's too soon to know whether they will or they won't.
Yeah, only I'm wondering is if it's showing the reduction like this compared to 2045 scenario versus new normal, if you show compared to today's congestion or 2025 congestion, 2045 no bid scenario is this, 2045 new normal is this. So everything relative to today, new normal may go up by 45% and no bid will go up 50%, right? So I can see the 5% reduction, but it's still significantly higher than today.
Yeah.
Would grab my attention more so than a lot of reductions on a piece of paper.
Well, we have some of that in the recent analysis of Visualize 2045. So exactly the kind of points you made and that Keith made, which is, well, you're investing billions in the transportation system, and there's going to be more congestion in the future. Scratch head. Well, there's also, regionally 1 million more people, 1 million more jobs, something like that. So we use the metric of per capita in addition to absolute number to say, well, still the per capita is going down, and also compare no build to build to look at where you've been. But then if you add scenario planning, this matrix gets real complicated quickly. So it's like, yeah, you're not looking at the right number, but you've got to look at 12 or 48 numbers to get the story. It is always a challenge to communicate what's going on with any of these things. It's going to be very interesting to see results of scenario analysis, but you're going to have a lot of numbers to digest.
I mean, just one other number to throw in the mix. Between 2017 and 2045, no build, no projects. The model is showing a 26% increase in vehicle miles traveled. So, from now to then, it's going to go up 26%, and then under the scenarios, it might come down, or it might go up, and then the scenarios, including the projects, the same thing. But underlying, expect that we're going to be dealing with 26% more trip making. So, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right in what you're saying, and we'll take a look at the way we've worded it to make sure we're clear on that. But I think people will read into it sometimes what they kind of think it's saying rather than what it actually says. And
Just a graphical representation. Sometimes you see all the negative numbers on the screen. That's all people remember. Nothing else.
Any other comments or questions? Thank you, Keith.
Sure.
That was great.
So my update is brief. The authority meets next week on July 14th, where we will be asking the authority to approve our 6 funding program, FY 2022 to 2027. The years that we're adding is 26 and 27. The 22 through 25 have been funded through previous funding programs. The recommendation is to fund 20 of the 26 projects that were submitted. The total ask, if you will, was 1.2 billion, but we're recommending funding 20 projects totaling $626 million. So that is the big thing on our agenda. And then the other big action item is asking the authority to approve the public comment period and public hearing date for the transaction. So this year, we're doing both of our major milestones in 1 year. Our 6-year program update, and we anticipate coming to the authority asking them to adopt the updated transaction in December of this year. And Madam Chair, that's all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Backman. Moving on to member updates. Would you like to begin, sir?
Well, do I have anything more than to say that we passed the Visualize 2045? Also, I have to think about when it happened. I don't know that I've told this group the TPD adopted CAD principles. I guess that was earlier this year. That's now incorporated into Visualize 2045. A lot of vision about how they would like to see, what would happen in the advent of connected and automated vehicles in the region. So those are baked into the new plan, and thought of it a little bit in the conversation about positive versus negative wording in the goals, because it's nice when you can word things positively, but sometimes it's hard to avoid that if some bad is really bad, you really want to be on the record and say, we don't want that bad to happen, and zero, zombie miles of travel is certainly one of those things. So I recommend taking a look at the Visualize 2045, because it's the culmination of a lot of work of our elected officials and lots of staff. Thanks.
Yes, ma'am. In the connected and automated vehicle space, we're continuing to make progress. We have kicked off a data mapping project with VDOT to start looking at different connected vehicle applications, what type of data is going to come out of those applications from these vehicles, and how we use that within VDOT. For example, I gave this example. If there is a pothole on the road, if you saw the news that came on today and yesterday about Tesla mapping the potholes and the road conditions. So right now, their software update they pushed just a suspension to account for the roughness of the road or the pothole in the road. Eventually, they're going to look at probably avoid and going around the pothole. So that's the kind of technology that will help us in understanding our infrastructure in the future as these vehicles are continuing to scan the roads and taking pictures and environment around them. What type of information could we get if there is a pothole of 10,000 vehicles going on the road, every one of them saying, there's a pothole, there's a pothole, there's a pothole, is not useful there. So we want to understand how do we get that information that there is a pothole and then triage that within VDOT to say this is big enough, it needs to be fixed right away, goes to a control room, dispatch somebody right away, or go to our work order system for somebody to go to the pothole, put it in their program next 2 days or whenever we get to it. So that's a triage system we need, and so there are all these types of things that give us an example. We're going to look at and see which systems within VDOT need to be modified to ingest that information coming from the vehicles, and also what systems we have in VDOT that we can push that out to the vehicles with the seed. And so that is the project we kicked off. We're going to be doing through the next 4 to 5 months, reviewing all our systems and figuring things out. And also we are in the process of kicking off a task to understand the needs of the blind community as well as wheelchairs community, senior citizen community. Those are the 3 groups we pick to understand the accessibility needs. And so as we think about the future of infrastructure with these connected vehicles, the biggest advantage or potential is to give the mobility to people that do not have the mobility today. But that's a nice theory that auto manufacturers are working towards that. But as an infrastructure owner operator, what do we need to do? What do we need to understand? How do we provide that connectivity? Do we need to modify any of our infrastructure to make that happen? So we're going to understand the needs of these groups with some workshops and some meetings with representatives from those 3 groups. And so that's another area that we want to understand better. The third area we're looking at is what standards that we need to change in our roadway design to accommodate all of these in the future. That again, if we start something, a design change process, it takes years for it to get implemented because we need to understand or respect without we can't just change the contract that are in the works already. It's going to be the future design contract that gets built 6 years from now. If we change something, it gets incorporated. So we need to always think ahead on these technologies that we want to kick off and accomplish this year. We're kicking off that task as well. So those are the three main things we'll be focusing on the connected vehicle space. We're looking at other technologies in general. We're working with VPPI and our maintenance contractor to develop an automated crash cushion that follows the lead vehicle. So if you think about the crash cushion is designed to protect the workers, but that's designed to take the hit. And we have a driver human sitting there driving the vehicle that is going to protect other people, but somebody is there to be injured. So we want to get the driver out of the truck, and VPPI is the technology to meet our needs. There are other states that have developed similar technology that they are looking to deploy, but they don't meet quite the requirements that we want to have in there before we take the driver out. So we're enhancing and developing that. So which we expect sometime in June, July of 2023, the technology is ready for deployment. So we need to look at it if this is something we can put on the road, what legal requirements, and do that. Legal requirements, can we technically get the driver out of the vehicle, and what the legal requirements are to change anything. That's something we're going to be looking at in the next year also. But we're excited about the opportunity about the automation for the crash cushion. That'll be the first vehicle that we are probably be putting out on the road. Any application that you can think of, that is the best application that you can think of. For a vehicle designed to get hit is where you need to take the driver out. So that's what we're focusing on.
Thank you. Dr. Schneider.
A couple of exciting things. We continue to proceed in our zero emissions bus study. Working with Kinley Horn, we're now in matrix mode and fleet development mode. So we've gotten past principles and ideas, and now we're getting into roadmap. Secondarily, on Thursday night, we hope the commission approves Sunday services. So for the first time on the eastern footprint of Prince William County, there will be transit service on Sundays. If you want to know what it looks like, look at our Saturday schedule. Because we're just going to have weekday service and weekend service. On a completely different note, or as what we should say now for something completely different. On the way in, I listened to a podcast today called Decoder Ring. And what they do is they do mysteries of pop culture. So and today they did the song Convoy, which was a popular song in the 1970s. Now you would think, what the heck does that have to do with this meeting? It was about surging fuel prices, convoys and anger and resentment, policy related, fuel access related to war. So if you just want to dip back 50 years ago, I encourage you to just look up Decoder Ring. It was from the spring, but I think an episode's called We Got Ourselves a Convoy. But it's very interesting to hear the discussions and the parallels and the very things. It's actually, everyone's upset about fuel prices, but it's better now than it was in the 70s. Because you aren't waiting in line, you know, we don't have all those different rules and requirements. But like I said, for something completely different. It's entertaining too.
These are online.
And I have nothing to add, so is there anything else that needs to be discussed before?
Maybe people are online if they have any.
Excuse me, I beg your pardon. The folks participating electronically?
This is Mike Garcia. I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Reg right here, nothing to add as well. Thank you.
Is there a third individual?
No, I think that's.
Okay, thank you. If there's nothing else, then we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're both done. Of all things, the pop in number 2 is one as well.
I have to check it out.
Yeah, I mean, it like really is.